Good morning.
Hello. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So, last time we were discussing the evolution and complexification of mindedness in the world through major transitions.
Yep.
Starting from with the matter, with things from the simple, working our way to the more complex, and beginning to work into different forms of phenomena for which we sometimes use the word conscious in different ways, but doing so where we were tracking the different senses in which and the different properties of these phenomena as they complexify and become. And this as part of an overall unified framework for knowledge and understanding the natural world, a cohesive worldview of, and a conciliant worldview of nature, our place in it, and how we can understand it. Maybe you should flip those two, or I don't know if the order matters. Probably just you.
Right. I think that captures it. That does a nice job. Exactly. So yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different pieces there. There's the worldview piece and the consciousness piece. I'm actually kind of grappling with both of those now and their relation. So I'm working, I think I mentioned working on a book on consciousness and really delineating what you talk specifically does, the unified theory of knowledge, and then how it fits in the larger naturalistic kind of worldviews. And how the stuff that I'm doing with John Vervaeke or how our meta theories sync up to, I think, really is a game changer in how we think about the hard problem of consciousness. And I've been spending that last year and a half has basically been my primary focus is to really dissect Chalmers. There's the explanatory gap, and then there's Chalmers' analysis of the hard problem, which I think is a powerful analysis, but I think it's seriously flawed, and it's time to get an update.
And in terms of dissolving the hard problem or challenging its framing, maybe it would be good to go into, even though you talked about it last time, going over that a little bit again today.
Sure. So Chalmers basically lays out the hard problem gets its frame because it's contrasted with the easy problems. Okay. And he argues that the easy problems essentially can be gripped through a cognitive, an emerging neurocognitive frame, which says, hey, we have a functional understanding of the mind as a functional information processing system. He calls that the psychological mind, which I think is a misnomer. But there's one meaning of mind that carries the aspects of functional information processing. But then we can work to try to explain the world this way, or at least the world of what I would call minded animals this way. But it leaves unaddressed how you get subjective qualitative experience of being, which he then labels the hard problem or the phenomenal mind. So the phenomenal mind is this thing that has all of these properties that we identify with. If we look at what consciousness means in the theory of consciousness or science of consciousness literature, as you and I discussed, consciousness can mean lots of different things. We can come back to it. But the core meaning in the context of scientific research, philosophy of consciousness is the subjective qualitative experience of being in the world, the qualities of redness, the subjective point of view that's embedded in it as an experiencing point of view or a perspective on the world. And then there's this somehow phenomenal architecture and things like access consciousness. And then maybe if you want to add narrative consciousness, that'd be generally human. But essentially, these would be a cluster of what I would call consciousness 2 properties or subjective consciousness properties. And these properties are extremely difficult to explain, according to Chalmers, from a standard physicalist approach, and that's separate from the functional mechanics, as it were, of the brain as an information processing system, which he interpreted as the cognitive revolution, sort of successfully gripping that aspect of the problem. Does that jive with your?
Jives well.
Okay. So then basically the hard problem is, hey, we do have a frame for the easy problems. And we were left over with this leftover subjective experience of being. I come in and basically say the argument is wrong that we have a frame for the easy problems. So I start with he overlooked the problem of psychology, okay, and argued that the traditional cognitive model does a fine job in situating our understanding of the mind as a functional information processing entity. We do need the idea that the mind is a functional information processing entity, but it is not sufficient to simply label the mind as a functional information processing system and be done with it. And in fact, you can see this in the debates between the traditional cognitive psychological approach, which frames the mind that way. It's mind with what the brain does. What the brain does is process information to functionally regulate behavior. And that's a reasonable conception, but it's not a complete concession. And 4E cognitive science, and David Chalmers' work with Clark, says actually if we have a functional information processing conception, especially when we look at human behavior, humans interact with the world that enables them to functionally information. So a calculator somehow interacts with the world, writing things down interacts with the world. We're clearly creating storage, memory, retrieval elements in the entire structure of our operating system as we interact with the world. So that means that the functional information processing just isn't inside the head, but it actually is iterative and extends out into the environment. And I agree with that. And we can talk about why that's an important point. But then you go the other way and you take radical behaviorism, which Chalmers does not understand. Chalmers does not understand radical behavior. Very few people actually understand Skinner's radical behaviorism. Radical behaviorism puts behaviors, which you normally think of the stuff outside, inside the head. So radical behavior calls these covert behaviors. And there are easy ways to see covert behaviors inside your head. My example is say a sentence out loud. Here's a sentence. And now say it privately. Yeah. That's a covert behavior. Okay. And so if behaviors can be seen in some ways that exist inside the head, and mind can be seen in some ways as existing between the animal, or in this case, humans, and the environment, then this idea that the mind is well defined as residing within the nervous system and just functionally understood. Functionalism is a crucial aspect for understanding what meditation is, but it's not sufficient. I mean, it's a necessary element. It's not sufficient. So UTOC says what we're missing is a framework for mindedness. That's what's actually missing, and that's the dimension of complexification inside and out that we need to see. It's a perception action loop, and mindedness allows us to bind the radical behavioral view, the traditional cognitive view, and the 4E cognitive science view into a whole, and see that they're essentially emphasizing different aspects of a complex adaptive system, a neuro-behavioral bios animal system that enables animals through a sensory motor loop to act in 3D behavioral space, to use the Michael Levin term.
So minds as cybernetic controllers, but also there's the behavior, the overt behavior we can observe, but also the mental processes, not necessarily, although I tend to think of this way, and taking it as Vygotsky suggests, like thought as internalized speech, like the example you gave.
Sure.
Like if you take the action perception cycle and it happens internally in simulation, or in so now the laws of learning and behavior now can apply to thought.
Totally. Absolutely. And I would go, and that's at the human level. We could do stuff. We want to really, for me, you really want to go down and you want to say the birds and the bees and the squirrels behave very differently than the plants, than the trees and the mushrooms. Okay. In the forest, go to the forest. It is wrong, fundamentally wrong, to label the actions of the birds and the bees behavior, because that's underspecified. Everything is behaving in some sort of way. It is the fact that the birds and bees are behaving so differently. It is the difference emphasis that they behave so differently than the behavior of the plants. Plants clearly behave. Atoms behave. The question is, how and why do bees, birds, and squirrels behave so differently than the living behavior? Okay. So there's a big confusion on the concept of behavior, whereby we use the term behavior both to link it to the rest of the scientific world. This is what John Watson screwed up, because he uses the term behavior both to connect it to the world as a continuity, and that allows you to do science on it. But he also then implied that this was a different kind of behavior, but never labeled it. Although in somewhere in writing, even John Watson called it mental behavior. Skinner ends up calling the key domain of behaviors interested operant. Hugh talks with its tree of knowledge says actually the proper description for the property of the kind of behavior we're talking is minded behavior, just like the proper description of the plant behavior is living behavior. Okay. And living behavior is a complex adaptive system of nested hierarchies, right? That you can differentiate between the animal and the environment. We call that minded behavior. And there is a functional hierarchical network taking place within the nervous system. If you want to call that the mind, you could. I would call that neurocognitive activity, or the domain of mind 1A. And then there's the domain of mind 1B. My point of this whole thing is actually our languaging system and the primary dimensions of frames of understanding are not consensually specified. And the debates between Fourier cognitive science, traditional cognitive science, and radical behaviorism make clear that Chalmers' supposition that we can define the easy problems is suspect. Okay. We haven't. I wouldn't have devoted my life to analyzing what the problem of psychology was if the cognitive revolution had come along and solved it. It didn't. And Chalmers says very clearly, the psychological mind has been solved and it fits within physicalist. I don't think that's right. And I think there's a lot of good arguments. If that's the case, then it opens up serious questions about, well, what is this thing called mental? How do we frame it in the world? And I argue that actually what Chalmers actually does with the hard problem is he conflates two fundamentally different problems. One, there is a problem of neurocognitive engineering. Okay, there is a problem that tries to understand how the first layer of mindedness, we'll call it the non-conscious neurocognitive layer, meaning the layer that's prior to the subjective conscious experience. How does that give rise to subjective conscious experience within the brain? And the second problem is a more general problem, is how do we relate the physical material world as understood by physics with our subjective phenomenological experience of being in the world as knowing subjects? Okay, that's actually a different question. It's a much more philosophical question. And so my work splits the hard problem ultimately into two fundamentally different problems. One I call the enlightenment gap. May have talked about that. Fundamentally, that's a philosophical framing problem about how we understand the world and our place in it. And then there's the neurocognitive engineering problem, which is the specific set of questions about how neurocognitive activity binds together to give rise to the subjective experience of being in the world that animals, including humans, have in relationship to things like seeing red and having a first-person perspectival view on the world.
So for us to say that we have the easy problems handled, so this would be an overstatement that, like, with the cognitive revolution, we were able to do forms of empiricism that we weren't able to do before.
That's true.
And so and make some traction on them. But what we did not have was a way of taking all these various phenomena and interrelating them and describing their becoming evolutionarily and developmentally, and how they and situating ourselves within this.
Perfect.
And so, yeah. And so for us to say solved it, while at the same time basically ignoring psyche.
Right, without I would say ignoring mindedness, that we don't have a frame for mindedness. I use psyche actually for a specific kind a vector. The psyche, the way I use the term psyche is actually to define the unique, particular, idiographic, subjective point of view from the point of view of the subject. So psyche actually is the term I use to bind the world from the vantage point of the unique, idiographic knower. And I actually contrast that with science. I argue that that there's a vector of subjectivity. We can get into that, and I use the term psyche. So for me, the term is mindedness. Like we should have access to the term mindedness, like we have an access to livingness in life. It is not hard for people to go out in the world and see life, right? There's a living tree. There's a, and then take a microscope and find all the bacteria, and where exactly the line. When you learn to see the world like I see it, you see mindedness all the time. When your dog comes up to you and nudges you, you see mindedness. That is mindedness. Okay. And we don't have that conception. And the unified theory shows you exactly how to place it in the world, how to recognize it as a nested hierarchical plane of existence that emerges through a functional information processing and communicative network pattern. Absent that, you fail to constrain and effectively contain and place mind in the world. Okay? That's the critique. So that's unnecessary.
This indexical situating of your point of view as being particular to you, and the ways in which it so this would be so sometimes people will talk about consciousness, what it feels like, and there's like a also think like what it feels like for whom, and so it could be taken that like some of what you're describing, like if you had this explanation for the perhaps personal but unique and situated perspective of an individual, some might say that this overlaps somewhat with what people are looking for with something like a solution to a hard problem.
Totally. Well, okay, so there's an onto-epistemological aspect here that I'm pointing to, a philosophical aspect, which has to do with the kind of knowledge that natural science provides us on the world. Natural science is a particular kind of knowledge system in my worldview. It's a particular epistemology that allows us to see a particular lensing structure that allows us to see a particular aspect of ontology. Okay. However, I do not, that's a claim I'm making. There's a thing called natural science. Natural science builds us a model to see the world in a particular way. And it's a brilliant and powerful lens, but it has a limit function on it. I do not believe that natural science is the path to the God equation, and whereby the God equation will yield all necessary and sufficient analyses of everything that's going to happen, has happened, and will happen with perfect predictive capacity in a complete explanatory network. That I find that weird. That anybody would suggest that science could do that. And the science is not anywhere near close to doing that. And I don't think that it's in the possible ever to afford that. So one of the things that I would say is there's a fundamental limit. There's a frame on natural science. There's a limit function on its epistemology on what it can know. And one of the things that it actually struggles to know based on its justification system, and which allows it to gain a lot of coherence, is to know the unique, particular, coincidental, idiographic experience of a particular instance of knowing within itself. So I actually think science is not, I think a science got an onto-epistemological limit function in some ways in that regard.
Two things that are coming to mind would be actually like Nietzsche talking about perspectivism, but also kind of pushing back against this singular God's eye view from nowhere that would have no particular interests and would explain all things. And I think I would think it's something that, like, I guess, like the close, so like universal descriptions, like within physics, I guess, like Lagrangians or Hamilton, like master equations could describe a system, but you're really just describing like the evolution of like a vector field description thing, but there's no things within it. You don't have anything like explanation. You have like a encompassing, complete description of an evolution, but within it there is no, there's nothing like explanation within it. There's nothing like.
Let me make it sort of concrete, I think, in a way that, so I'm writing, one of the book chapters that I'm doing is on, in consciousness, there's the knowledge argument, okay, about Mary, right? So, Mary, you probably come across this as Mary and the neuroscientist, and she studies color vision, okay? But she's in a black and white room, all right? But apparently she's omniscient when it comes to color vision, and so she should know everything there is to know, which would include the neurocognitive engineering problem about how non-conscious vision, say that which affords blind sight, then gets translated into vision that's actually subjectively experienced. And so, but she herself has never experienced anything. And so then when she goes outside of the room, she comes across a red tomato and boom, sees red for the first time. Does she learn anything new about the world? That's the big question. Okay. And then there's this huge debate back and forth in relationship to whether or not, the objective knowledge of her neuroscience allows her to get all the facts she needs to know about red. Okay. I want to make this, by making the point that I'm making is here, let me use a slightly different example. Okay. And make it point about what almost everybody that takes this example says, well, she can have personal capacities and learning, okay, that take place in the world that are not accounted for by science. Okay. Like, for example, many people will use the example that she could learn everything there is to know about the kinesthetic system, but it wouldn't mean she would know how to ride a bike. Right? Then nobody has any problems with saying then she could learn how to ride a bike, and then that would be personal procedural capacity knowledge that she would then gain. But personal procedural capacity knowledge is not the kind of knowledge that science has about everything works. And by virtue of having the knowledge of everything works, she wouldn't necessarily automatically know procedurally how to run a bike. Very few people make that argument. They're just making the argument that there is something to be known about how the non-conscious neurocognitive activity of vision turns into the fundamental experience of being. And I agree with this generally. But here's my analysis. Does that make sense? So we're saying the people will say, yeah, that doesn't mean she knows how to ride a bike. Let's imagine she studies faces, okay, and facial recognition. She's an absolute vision expert on vision to facial recognition, but she's been locked in a room all day or her whole life, and she doesn't know what her nephews look like. She wouldn't know what her nephews look like by virtue of knowing what the faces are, right? But when she stepped outside and she saw her nephews for the first time, would she gain any new knowledge? And the answer is she'd gain new knowledge about the personal idiographic meaning of her nephews and their facial configurations. Okay. Now, no one that I've ever talked to in science says, well, obviously she would have exact knowledge of. No, that would be personal. In fact, all the people that are supporting the knowledge argument says she can gain personal knowledge. That's not what we're presupposing. We're not presupposing that Mary has all personal knowledge of everything that's ever happened. That would be ridiculous. Okay. Science actually doesn't grant you that. In fact, its entire epistemology is based on justifying things that are reliable and valid through generalized measurement. That's what science, that's that justification system for science. Is reliable, valid, generalized findings. Okay, that allow you to literally generalize to make valid as predictions and assertions. Idiosyncratic instances that have no validity in the sense that they have no reliable generalizability do not essentially exist from the vantage point of a scientific knowledge system. And they are then framed as
an error.
They are framed as error. That is what the lensing of science and the vectors that you're talking about has gaps in it that are not construed to be meaningful, precisely because they are idiosyncratic instances that then arise out of the vectorial intersections of the real causal structures. And the only way to understand the world, at least that we could conceive of in the way our system, is to abstract about those generalized vectors, use science to pull out what those generalized vectors are, and then utilize the vectors to map the possibilities, make predictions, and see which one of our vectors and why we would expect them to generalize. And the massive power of science is this ability to do this to its limit function. That's what science would afford us. But it, by definition, is limited. In that it will never, unless you're really going to say that science will turn you into a god and say, I know exactly why the blue bird just flew across at exactly this angle and exactly this time in a completely unrelated causal matrix that happens to coincidentally intersect. You can't explain that shit from science. Human built a system for generalized abstraction based on reliable, valid findings. That's what science gives you, which is great. It's beautiful, but don't mistake it for everything. That's a ridiculous assertion by virtue of its justificatory structure. It's built on a particular justificatory structure that's super powerful, but it isn't God. It's not even close to God. Can't solve the three-body problem. I mean, come on, right? You know, it's like people fantasize about what this thing can do based on all of its power, and they give it basically godlike powers in my estimation. I love science. I'm a scientist. But science has I've never read a scientific article that explained why I was sitting in my bed in a particular position reading a scientific article at that particular time of day with that particular set of food in my stomach, with the coffee steaming in a particular way. Science gives me the breakdown of all these particular types of behaviors through reliable and generalized maps, and then I put them together to sort of make sense. Science doesn't say Gregg Henriques at 2:35 a.m. will be reading coffee and look to his left. I mean, reading coffee, drinking coffee, reading book, look to his left. I mean, what the fuck? There's nothing there for that, as far as I'm concerned.
And so this is more though than just like a available data issue, or even theoretically, I guess you would say, I don't know, processing power or ability to or modeling capacity issue, like in terms of like the Laplace's God scientist, where we're like the view, the being which at one given instant has, the description, has the information on all things, the present and the past would be there before its eyes. I forget exactly how he said it, but this, so like, this is more than just in terms of the limits of science, like in this hypothetical world, which we will never encounter, where we had the full state description of the universe, and we had and we had the ability to make use of this information and process and to simulate in different ways, and maybe even like while we're going nuts, we could say even like simulate quicker than like the speed of the universe or something like this, and like play it forward, and then have like you reading your book in this particular time of day and get there before you do it.
Right.
That's still not necessarily the same thing as explaining you and that circumstance. Like,
right. There's two, and in fact, there's two fundamentally different issues. Okay. So there's the idiosyncratic particular error problem. All right. So this is what I mean, that for you to have a real science that would explain everything, you have to explain all coincidence. So that means you can't rely on valid, reliable models at all. You have to take all valid generalizations and place them in dynamic relationship to each other across all time to place understanding of error so that there is no error. So you need a scientific theory that has no error. Okay, that means that you would never need to run an experiment because you'd already know exactly what the experimental, even if you fucked it up, you would know exactly what the experiment would be. That's the science would tell you, oh, you already know you're going to put the wrong amount of here in the wrong temperature and going to screw up the chemical result. And the chemical result then of the error of the messed up experiment will exactly be this. Right? I mean, that's what you would have to know. So you would be done with all experimentation. You'd be done with all prediction. You would be done. You wouldn't need to simulate. And by the time you're at the place where you've accounted for all error, you have accounted for everything that can possibly happen. And again, you've turned yourself into God. So you're asking for a scientific explanation, a predictive vision explanation that basically turns the universe into a block, an Einsteinian blockchain that you can see every particular slice in every particular instance through a frame of reference understanding. That to me is the God equation. And I think it's grossly often underappreciated how unbelievably impossible and alien that is to the kind of scientific justificatory structures we have built. That's not what science did. Science built generalizable understandings and then created quantifiable models of those things, actually tried to factor out mind and apply the mathematical languaging structure through experimentation and deduction to model generalizable phenomena at increasingly abstract levels. And that's why we get reduction, because reduction is understanding generalizability. It turns out that mass coalesces in a particular way that gives rise to lots of generalizable claims about how it shapes space and time. And that's an unbelievably important thing. It's remarkably generalizable. Science binds these generalizable structures together and gives us models. Okay? Models about how the real underlying general mechanisms should give rise to actual unfoldings and empirical results. To use Roy Bhaskaar's brief, quick summary of ontological framing from real general mechanism to actual and empirical and observable. You can use this any number of ways. All I'm saying is that when you bring science to bear, I am asking science, can you solve the problem of the idiosyncratic error? And the answer is no. Its entire justification system is to build reliable, generalizable frameworks and then put those together and make predictions. That's what it is. That's what it does. It doesn't give you God knowledge. It gives you that kind of knowledge. I mean, look at what grounds the empirical methodology, epistemological structure of science. Data, prediction, deduction, reduction to particular other alternative explanations, and tracking. That's what our models are. And they track out a reliable, generalizable phenomena. That's what they do with increasing levels of specificity. But the idea that you could get to error is ridiculous. It's absurd. So you can't get coincidental error on the one hand. And the second thing is that there's a flip. There's an ontoepistemic flip. When I'm on the outside of you, I'm looking and the world is looking from this perspective. We are tracking, we have an epistemic frame of which you are a part of, right? So I'm tracking your lensing structure as part of my ontology, which goes through my epistemology. When we go to your index position, we flip that. Right? You see through your epistemic frame, and the rest of the world then is ontological. All right. So each subject actually has an inversion, an ontic epistemic inversion. I'm organized by my epistemic looking outward. All right. That's to you, then that is part of the ontological world. My interiority is part of the ontological world. My interiority epistemically organizes my ontological world. Okay. As I see it. In other words, just the bottom line is there's an perspectival inside-outside view of the subject. The way at least perspectival knowledge operates. Perspectival knowledge operates from an inside out versus outside in view. That's why you can't see what I'm seeing.
Thinking of Borges and that short story, you could have a perfect map that's identical to the thing you're mapping. But what's the use of such a map if it has to be just as complicated? But like the game of science is we're creating these useful simplifications that can generalize across different circumstances to give us this explanatory and predictive leverage where we can fill in more information based on what we have. But in doing this, this game is different than the game of God prediction and seeking unified. It's different than a view from nowhere. It's map making is different than trying to explain all things.
Totally.
And so some would this isn't like this admission of it's not even necessarily an admission, but this like identification of like, what is it that we're trying to do when we're doing science and expressing its limits. It's not putting us in a postmodern anything goes situation, but it's rather, you know, it's just expressing the limits of what we can expect given what we're trying to do when we're doing science, what we can expect to do.
Right. And I'm saying science is a system, a propositional network system that functions to legitimize certain things. That's what I'm saying. It functions to legitimize a modeling system of the universe, in essence. We can get into some of the, but essentially creating a map of the territory through what? Through mathematical formalized models at its best that creates good explanations, to use a David Douche term, whereby we're eliminating and binding our explanations to what's possible with tighter and tighter power, which is great, you know. And I believe in the realism of science. I'm not questioning the realism of science or its precision. And we're not doing social convention shit here. I'm not arguing that. I'm simply arguing that it's, by definition, it's a particular kind of justification system. That's all. And it has limit functions that a justification system will have limit functions on. You know, it's got certain kinds of data and certain kinds of ways it builds its legitimizing structures, and therefore it puts constraints on ultimately what it can know. Certainly constraints at where we are in this century. I mean, science is going to have to transform itself into something very different to get the kind of knowledge I'm talking about, for sure.
This is, yeah, I think you're convincing me. I'm going to start changing the way I've been talking about some of the ways of the sense making I've been doing around my work and trying to bring together different theories of consciousness and you know, attempts at coming at unified understandings. Where, so I was interpreting what I was trying to do as solving the hard problem in terms of like if I could eventually have a you know, multi-level understanding of how you move from a third to first person ontology, how you can get a system to have a point of view on the world and to have a perspective, not necessarily the full indexical psyche. Like, I mean, that would be even more stuff if you get there, but could you get there? But just the idea of like, how can you get something like a qualia generator? How can there be like a physical system where it is generating the particular feels from moment to moment in the stream of experience?
Yep.
And saying, well, would that be the solution to the hard problem? So, but not quite though. Like,
well,
so
yeah. So you and I are after the same thing. I mean, I read your paper and I'm like, that's actually what I found, basically. So all I'm saying is that what you don't mistake. There's still a category error going on with subjective phenomena. We'll put it simply: there's a subjective phenomenology category error. That if you're going to try to explain Mary's experience of seeing her nephews in her brain, you've made a category error. Okay? So don't all I'm saying is don't stop with red, because red's a generalizable feature. The instance in which she sees the face of her nephews is what I am talking about. Okay? And that's a unique idiosyncratic. There's no way that you can get a scientific theory that explains that Mary is not going to know what the faces of her nephews look like. That's all. Okay. Meaning there's massive limitations. Once we add personal knowledge to the reality of experience of being in the world, which it is, I mean, personal knowledge is not generalizable, but personal knowledge is a ontic epistemic loop of instance. It's an instance of ontic epistemics in the world. I'm having the experience of an appearance of reality in an epistemic network. That is what, that's what it is. So, and to say that I can explain that through the different medium of a totally lower operative system from a third point of view, that's where the mistake is. But we do want to be able to understand the nature of nature, okay, the nature of mindedness, to have a framework so that it is not like some unbelievable mystery, like something that we need strong emergence as some magic that says, hey, there's no way that I can get there from there. What I'm pointing to is there's an epistemological framing issue, not necessarily an ontological mystery, but there's an epistemological framing mystery. And you need both subjective phenomenology as an epistemological vector in the world, and you need objective behavioral science as a vector in the world. And there's no reason to think that you can reduce one to the other. That's what I'm saying. So you just need two epistemic vectors. In fact, according to you, Talk, you need a third epistemic vector.
You could be, I want to get into the third epistemic vector, but like you could be, I think, easily misinterpreted as like you're trying to, it's like an argument from consequences where you're trying to like protect some like special aspect of experience from science. And so that's why you want to place a limit, but that's not the motivation at all. It's more, you're trying to situate like, how is it that we are knowing things? What is the most cohesive understanding we can have? And so to explain nature, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, as we try to understand it, let's track the modes of understanding, what they can't do. And it's not, there might be some payoffs which are where we do like the consequences potentially. So like maybe something like a sense of the numinous, or like a sense of like there's some aspects where I don't know, we may grant them a certain dignity we might not otherwise, in terms of like there being aspects we don't feel like we have fully explained just because it's beyond the limits of what we can reduce. But the point is not necessarily the point is not to protect experience from science. It's just to have clarity on what is it that we're doing when we're doing science, and how can we account for experience in the different forms of mindedness and ourselves, and what can we expect, and what ought we not to expect, given
right. It's really what ought we not expect, and so that's the thing that Utah will come along and say, actually, our propositional knowledge is organized by systems of justification. Those create systems of justification operate by particular kinds of constraints. They operate by particular kind of rules. Objective natural science is a particular kind of system of justification. It's a propositional knowledge system, okay, that is designed to try to factor out your subjective experience of being, and it's designed to factor out social values, and then try to reveal an unfolding wave and articulate a change process that enables you to have generalizable claims about real functions that produce actual results. And it creates a map of that based on generalizable, valid, reliable results. And it creates a feedback loop whereby it makes predictions about data based on models, eliminates other alternatives, and then feeds back to validate its particular model. That's what it does. I'm not saying it. If you read any basic model of what science is about, and if you give any epistemological,
this is what it is to construct models. This is what we mean when we say we are modeling things.
This is when we say they're modeling.
This is just the meaning of the word modeling.
That's what exactly. And when Stephen Hawking at the end of time says we'll never know for sure because we're always making predictions and you have a generalizable freaking model. If, by the way, you instantaneously knew that Stephen Hawking was going to say that sentence in that moment at that time through his particular thing, because you knew he would have Lou Gehrig's disease, okay? Like what scientific system could possibly know all that? All of that is happening because of all sorts of confluence of different things that you don't have access to from reliable and generalizable frames, precisely because reliable generalized frames are coalescing with each other across all sorts of networks that only a God would be able to make sense out of, and God doesn't need science. Right? I mean, so I just want to say that's a human process that builds a human system of justification that knows about the world in a particular way. That's totally different than me sitting in the here and now having coincidental subjective experiences. Those things are just totally different things. Mary knows what it is when she sees her nephews, and everybody that talks about the knowledge problem. Well, that's her personal knowledge. Yeah, no shit. Well, what is that? So you're envisioning a scientific understanding of the world that would trump Mary's personal knowledge? We know better scientifically what Mary's actually experiencing when she sees her nephews. And we knew it was going to happen at 2:30 on Monday when she met her sister and was let out of that room, precisely because we understood all cause and effect of every damn thing across every level of analysis. I mean, why are you mistaking science for God? I don't get it. I mean, that's not what science is at all. Science is anywhere near that. I mean, it's just not what it is as a knowledge system. So I think people have been sometimes mistaken and replaced God, science for God in some ways. All I'm saying is just pay attention to just what it is. It built the standard theory of elementary particle physics. It built large hadron colliders. It enabled us to do all sorts of different kinds of things. But it didn't turn us into knowing all events that are about ready to happen instantaneously right now.
So you're actually what you're suggesting is it's not just even a confusion about what we're doing. That's I guess, to what degree is this actually a hangover or a legacy of all the millennia or longer, or not longer, but all the time we spent thinking in terms of God, as and to what extent is it an emotional need for it? Like, to what extent is it like is it a habit, and to what extent is it that when people are doing this and trying to conflate the limits of scientific understanding or what we're hoping to achieve with God knowledge, to what extent is this actually a kind of yearning for something like God?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, and I don't think you have to shoot, the whole, when we had the Newtonian frame of reference and the idea there was absolute space, absolute time, okay, and there was absolutely necessary and sufficient causation, and we knew that necessary and sufficient causation would have to produce necessary and efficient sequence, you would have a fantasy that actually create a Laplacian deterministic universe. That to me is pretty understandable. And people then want to pursue that, okay? Philosophically, we could ask interesting questions in relationship to it, et cetera, okay? And indeed, in interesting ways, that connects to, but also replaces God, all right? But notice all of that is a complete abstraction relative to a more concrete, like, what has science given us? How does it actually work in the world? And what kind of knowledge does it produce? That's all I'm asking. And all I'm telling you is let's constrain what science is currently and has been for the last 500 years. It's a particular kind of justification system that gives us a particular kind of knowledge of the world. That's what it's, and it's actually, when I ask it, will it ever know why I'm doing this and why this coin is flipped over at this point, at this angle, with this rip in my table? No one thinks that. I mean, tell me anybody that had a theory of that, knew that was going to happen. I mean, it's just absurd. It's all abstraction. And it's interesting abstraction. All I'm trying to say is currently, and for the next 100 years, let's recognize just what science is based on how we built it. And its limit functions of constraint. That's all. It's constrained by its own justification system for reliable and generalizable behavioral knowledge. That's what it's after. And does a great job of that. But it's not God. It's simple. At least not yet. Maybe it will become God in 100 years. I don't know. So I just want to be concrete. And then I want to flip it around and say there's subjective, phenomenological knowledge in the world. Like, that's a different kind of knowledge. It's not reliable and generalizable. So that sucks. I mean, at least in terms of anywhere near the same way that science is. That's why we got science, because we need a reliable and generalizable knowledge. And we built science to do that. Okay. But the people that came along and said, well, now we're going to eliminate your consciousness and replace it with objective third-person knowledge. Seriously? I mean, Dan Dennett plays around with this, but Dan Dennett, of course, didn't do this. Like, he didn't go home and said, I consulted dear Miss Dennett, I don't know his wife's name. I read a scientific article which told me what I should be doing today with you. I don't think Dennett did that.
there's both, I guess, the limits of what we can expect from scientific practice as the kinds of beings we are. But so you just said, like, maybe 100 years from now, maybe it's different. But I guess what I'm wondering is, like, could it be different even then? Like, even if, for instance, like, somehow we were magically granted the complete state description of the universe, there's no Heisenberg uncertainty principle even, and let's say it's a deterministic world for the sake of argument, and we have every last piece of information. Well, I guess I wonder is, like, are we still outside, even if we have something that godlike in terms of, like, now, are we still limited in terms of, once, like, this all-including view, there are no things necessarily. Like, to even talk about anything in its particular, to single something out and put boundaries around it. There's like, are you necessarily simplifying and throwing away?
I mean,
Talk
I
about
think that certainly the nature of any kind of onto-epistemological philosophical knowing that I can envision has to have those kinds of elements to it, meaning it's got to have an epistemological frame, it's got to have a particular perspective, it's as expansive as you get, it doesn't turn into the thing itself, unless it does, and by the time it's turning into the thing itself, then I'm saying it's God. I can't relate to that. And it's beyond my ken to be able to wonder what kind of intelligence would have access to that. And to me now, I want to build a worldview for the back half of the 21st century. That's what I want. Okay. And part of the worldview problems that we have are we don't have a conciliant system that places mind and consciousness in the world and aligns this is what the Enlightenment gap says. We can't place mind and consciousness effectively in the world. So that you and I are just talking about it the way we talk about. I think we can put life pretty effectively in the world. Okay. We should be able to put mind and consciousness effectively in the world. So we're not actually hashing out every conversation's a damn hash out of definitions. It's ridiculous. All right. And we shouldn't have it as be a mystery. I don't think it's a mystery. I don't experience it as a mystery. Why do I have subjective phenomenological experience of being in the world? That doesn't feel like a mystery to me. Okay. And what is the dynamics of that? And how do I understand that from a scientific perspective? And how do I understand it as Gregg Henriques with a fiance and a family? Okay.
Why do you use the term enlightenment when you say Enlightenment gap?
Precisely because it is the scientific enlightenment and the construction of physics from Galileo to Newton that builds a particular kind of justification system. Okay. That then basically is a mind-independent justification system that behaviorally maps entities and change in the world, that creates a reliable and generalizable frame of reference from essentially a third-person view of nowhere, everywhere, and bound.
Primary versus the secondary characters.
Well, that's exactly then Galileo's era. Read Phil Goff's first half of that book, Galileo's era, is great about how the justificatory system is designed to factor out the subjective and social imputations that particular individuals or groups place on the world, either through their secondary sense impressions or through their value. Okay. That's why, can science tell you, one of my questions I always ask my students is, does science prove to you that Hitler was evil?
Sam Harris would say yes.
Well, no, he doesn't actually.
No.
He doesn't, because Sam Harris, so what Sam Harris says is, well, you need to give me an applied point with well-being. You have to grant me that I care about well-being. In other words, you have to add a humanistic value. And then once you add a humanistic value, sure, you can do applied.
Then you have a moral landscape, but you have to
you have to lens it science, and he'll be clear about it. He doesn't say that I know scientifically that well-being, I can prove scientifically that well-being is the value I ought to prove. He says well-being makes perfect sense from sort of a moral scientific perspective. I mean, a moral humanistic perspective. Well-being's a great argument, and I agree. In fact, I emphasize dignity, well-being, and integrity as big three values that we ought to choose, but I don't justify that through science. Science is not equipped to tell me what are the values we ought to morally bind to. It's limited. This is the third justification, by the way.
You just said well-being, integrity, and dignity, or dignity and integrity.
Dignity, well-being, and integrity. So UTalk then says, actually, all right, so in UTalk, we have a saying, marry the coin to the tree in the garden under God. That's our saying, okay, for the operating system. What does it mean? The coin is your particular, unique, particular, specific perspective as an ontic epistemic instance of awareness in the world from the inside out view. That's the coin, okay? So the coin is just a placeholder for you having coincidental experiences of awareness. So it's not a theory of it. It just says you're having coincidental experiences of awareness in the universe. There's an ontic epistemic instance. If I see the coin, this is, and this is, how do you dispute that? No, I'm not seeing the coin, even if I'm in a simulation. This is Descartes, essentially. It's not I think, therefore I am, but I am having an instance of awareness at some level. So that's what the coin is. The tree is the tree of knowledge. And it says science reduced us to the foundational layer and now is trying to build back up some model of emergence. We can track the model of emergence through living organisms, minded animals, cultured persons, the evolution of science itself, and loop that thing back so that we actually know what scientists are and scientific theories are in the furniture of the universe. And that's the nice thing about the tree of knowledge, is that it includes science as a particular kind of justification system at a framing level of what it is. I argue you can't reduce science to the laws of physics. Science isn't in the laws of physics. You need a framework that explains the reduction to the laws of physics that also includes our capacity to know about the laws of physics. So anyway, the picture of the tree of knowledge includes science as a particular kind of thing that emerges out of culture, which emerges out of mind, which emerges out of life, which emerges out of matter, which emerges out of energy. And that gives you your basic frame for thinking about what kinds of knowledge natural science has generated from a reliable and generalizable framework that binds together our understanding of behavior at the matter level, the life level, the mind-animal level, and the culture-person level. Okay? And then you could see the world through the lens of the tree of knowledge as an unfolding wave of behavior. Okay? And what does that mean? It means scientists, say human psychologists, could take this tape, take our transcript, run our transcript through the systems of justification, and analyze our behavior as human persons in the world from a particular lens of behavioral investment, influence, justification. And we could get lots of reliable and good understandings of why the hell we're talking the way we are from a third-person human behavioral perspective. That's nested inside us as minded animals, that's nested inside us as living organisms, it's nested inside the material universe. That's all science from this vantage point. It's a third-person generalizable pattern of behavior that uses reliable generalizable concepts to map the territory.
So there's the tree and the garden.
Right. Well, then there's the garden. So now you marry the coin, which is your unique, particular, idiosyncratic perspective, to the tree so that I can now see myself, so that I can say to you, here I am as a unique particular Gregg, that with all of this, and I can also say I'm a human person that justifies action. Their actions. I'm a human person justifying actions is a generalizable scientific claim that I can apply to you, I can apply to any person that has the capacity to justify. I can apply it to people like my mom who's got dementia, and I can say her justification system is breaking down. I can use a scientific, reliable, generalizable set of understandings to track behavior, make predictions, and organize my understanding. That's what science does. It's beautiful. Okay? And now at the same time, I'm living my unique, idiosyncratic, particular life through my perspectival epistemic portal that binds me into the real world, the real large world, and encounters error all the time. I mean, I'm basically error. I mean, there's all sorts of random shit happening to me, but it's an empirical system that allows me to measure that and integrate it in my unique particular vector. I mean, that's my subjective, that's Gregg. Gregg doesn't generalize. Gregg's a vector. Okay. And all I'm saying is that the coin holds the vector of the unique particular human identity, and then the tree places that in a scientific generalizable understanding. Because there's two different vectors of justification that humans have built for understanding the world. Or we need them to place in relation. Then the garden, by the way, the garden represents the intersubjective cultural collective narrative that binds all of it together into a story that orients from what is toward what ought to be. This is why I said it's the third vector. You have to bring in the garden is the intersubjective collective, okay, narrative. To see these things, in the book I am writing, I use the example of 3 tables. Okay, Arthur Eddington's a famous physicist who gave a lecture on 2 tables in the Giffords lecture. I think it's 1929, maybe 27, doesn't matter. But he's a famous physicist, okay? In fact, he's the guy that validated Einstein's general relativity, went on the mountains and shit like that, all right? And his 2 tables, he comes to the audience and says this. He says, there's one table that I've learned about in my education as a physicist that tells me this table is organized mostly space. It comes up with a bunch of particles. They're bound together by particular forces I can't possibly see. And this is the reality, the physical reality of this table, table 1. There's a second table that I open my eyes that looks brown to me. It looks mostly stuff. It's extended in space. It sits here in a particular way. I, relate to it through my experience of being. In other words, he relates to it through his secondary, subjective mind impression properties that makes it look like a table. And then on the flip side, he has this explanation that it's particles and atoms and molecules and forces in a accounted for this way. And he asked, how on God's earth do we put these 2 tables together? And he said that you cannot reduce this table to this table. Okay? That's what he argued. And I would argue that actually, let's turn it into, from a regular table, let's turn it into a Thanksgiving table. Okay. Now we have 3 tables, because the Thanksgiving table brings in the fact that it's got a bunch of cultural meanings to it. Like, is Thanksgiving good? How do Native Americans feel about Thanksgiving? How do people from India feel about Thanksgiving? They have no reference for Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is bound to the United States and North America through a particular set of things, and you get a whole bunch of traditions. And although my family knows what Thanksgiving is, that is an intersubjective shared narrative of cultural tradition that has belief values about what's good, what ought to be, what's tradition and relation, blah, blah, blah. Okay? Utalk says that human knowing has 3 irreducible vectors that need to be related. One vector is the subjective experience of being unique, particular primate. This, by the way, is where the hard problem of consciousness shows up. A second vector is the shared propositional language systems that people build to coordinate their actions for group identity. This binds is and ought together in cultural narratives. When you say you're an American, or you like Thanksgiving, or you like Trump, you're binding yourself to a particular cultural narrative. And the last is we built a system of justification in physics that is a novel kind of way that works to try to factor out your subjective phenomenology and social value to behaviorally describe the world in as generalizable and reliable terms as possible. That's science, objective natural science. Those 3 vectors sit right now in our world, and they're unintegrated. They're not bound together. They're not properly interrelated. We don't know how to do that. Consilience is a view that you could do it. E.O. Wilson was super clear you couldn't do it. The hard problem of consciousness means you can't do it. My argument about the problem of psychology means you can't do it. John Vervaeke's comment that we don't know what mind is. All of those things are ways of saying that we lack a big picture worldview that ontologically describes the world and aligns our epistemological viewpoints of a subjective knower, a cultural knower, and what science, starting with physics, says about the world into a coherent symphony that properly places the vectors in right relationship with other without inconsistencies. That's what we're missing. That's what we don't have. Modernity doesn't have that at all. Utalk has that. Utalk's crystal clear about how to take each one of these things, play each one of the notes, and turn it into a symphony. And with no mystery. or no gaps.
The payoff of this, of such a conciliant understanding, so like better shared sense making, and like how many debates that we currently have are because of the lack of such an understanding, for instance, or how many like of the like
Huge. I mean, it's endless. Like, for example, take the major theories of consciousness, okay? Just one example, right? Okay, hey, integrated information. Hey, is consciousness about conscious contents that fundamentally bind together because these are the fundamental roots of phenomenological experience, right? Is consciousness a recurrent processing loop in relationship to a core back front element because there's a hierarchical predictive processing conversation going, network going on? Oh, is it a higher order theory? Or is it fundamentally global access to, global workspace for conscious access? Okay. I mean, you look at this from this angle, it's like, yes. Okay. Come on, guys. You don't even have the framework for differentiating a mind two system in Utah's language. There's a mind two system that emerges, and mind two binds all of these properties like qualia, subjective point of view, phenomenological architecture, access consciousness, adds mind three for narrative consciousness. It says, here's the system inside of a mind one emergence, which, by the way, Chalmers gets wrong calling it a psychological mind. It's actually a system of mindedness. And then there's a recursive loop, a higher order recursive loop on that system that's metabolizing information coming out of the neurocognitive activity rather than just the brain. So don't look for neural correlates of consciousness, look for neurocognitive correlates of consciousness. And when you do, to see a core back front structure. And then you look at your own subjective experience of being. And when I see a duck or a rabbit on a duck rabbit illusion, or when I wake up and experience my conscious field, or when I experience a mood shift, all that shit's right online when you get the system and the properties bound together and recognize this as a virtual reality headset of a perspectival epistemic portal. It's integrating world models. Like, where the fuck is the mystery? Yeah, there's certainly neurocognitive engineering problems. Why exactly does occipital lobe give rise to vision in relationship to all this other stuff? And yeah, sure. But the overarching constraint binding the structure to the thing that we actually figured out 500 years ago, everyone thought the damn heart was the seat of consciousness. Come on. We've made serious problems. We bound this thing and we have a particular frame of reference. If you know how to talk about it like mind two, then you realize the various theories of consciousness are pointing to a system that can bind together the properties that have never been effectively bound together. The reason they haven't been effectively bound together is because the Enlightenment gap prevented us to create a whole frame of relevance to realize the various parts and how they're interrelated. UTalk solves that problem. It gives you the frame of relevance from a naturalistic perspective that actually binds to subjective consciousness and the human justification systems for morality and meaning and modes of thought like science itself. And, what would be different if we actually had a system of worldview, coherent worldview, Adam? What would be different? Lots. What is the problem that we have? What's the meaning crisis? There's lots of things that go into it. One thing is we don't have any constraints on a knowledge into wisdom system that we actually consensually agree upon. If we had something like consensual agreement about what is and what we ought to do across nations, across religions, across groups, across products, wow, would that be a little bit different in relationship to the way we would coordinate our nested hierarchies? I think so. I think it'd be massively different.
So yeah, two cases or two payoffs or costs, depending on how you're viewing it, of not having a conciliant understanding would be So the warring theories of consciousness. Most recently, there is the very underwhelming adversarial collaboration between IIT, integrated information theory, and global workspace theory. Tens of millions of dollars, countless like lives, or not countless, like person hours, or like lives, a good number of lives spent on it. And is consciousness in the front of the brain or the back of the brain, when the theories are actually potentially sometimes getting at different types of mindedness, or not even seeing.
They're not, well, right. They can't even say, okay, there's a system called Mind 2 that emerged out of neurocognitive activity. This system's a perspectival epistemic portal. This perspectival epistemic portal has got a generalizable field that's going to come out of a core and a first order processing system. It then gives rise to a second order processing system that metabolizes conscious contents, generally in the back of the brain, then has conscious access to an extended working memory workspace. I mean, doesn't that describe both theories right there in a super simple way, right? Like, why don't we all just agree on that?
The brain, back of the brain depends which part of the elephant and which sets of the elephant are we thinking of.
Precisely.
It's not yes or no. It's which parts of the
both and like, can we at least get a definitional system? And my point is, and by the way, consciousness is about properties of subjective awareness. Mind 2 is the system. Another analogy I'm using in my book is that imagine a scenario in which, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Gods Must Be Crazy, but that's where a Coke bottle drops out of a plane and lands in a tribe in the Sahara Desert, I think, and they don't know what it means, and they build all sorts of things. And it's an interesting story about that from the 1980s. Anyway, let me do a thought experiment on this variant. So this time it's an isolated tribe, okay? And there's a big, one of these big cargo ships that got cars on it that are ready to drive, and a hurricane comes and washes it off, and these cars drive up, and they happen to be dune buggies, and so you can drive them around. And so nowhere in history have this tribe encountered any modern technology that has any capacity to actually like start and move on its own. So then you get these cars that are dune buggies that they can now all of a sudden they fool around with them. They learn how to turn them on and start driving. Okay. And now these things come alive and they move. And so there's a property of carness to these individuals. That it's carness, right? Because there's something very unique about this binding structure. They must have some essence inside of there that binds all these weird properties, like it turns on, it moves by itself. So the tribes people can have this theory of, oh my God, there's a carness kind of thing, okay? That are where all these properties bind together in this unbelievably weird system, which we can't possibly explain at all. And obviously you and I would be like, actually, it's a theory of a car, right? And because we have a theory of a car, we understand where or why all these properties sit in the world that they do. Now look at theories of consciousness. You need a theory of mind 2 as the car, and consciousness is talking about the properties of carness. But they're not specifying that they also need a system that binds those properties together. And that's why Utah comes on and says, actually, it's a perspectival epistemic theory of mind 2 that is also a theory of consciousness, in the sense that we mean consciousness 2 properties of subjective experience of being in the world, right? That binds a particular embodied experiencing subject to conscious contents in a field of experience across time. And that's what we're talking about. Well, mind 2 tells you the system, and then it binds all of these properties together. And it doesn't answer every freaking question, but it's like, oh, we have a theory now of cars and carness. Theories of consciousness just have carness. They're like, I will get a theory of carness without cars. Good luck. Right? And it's and all I'm saying is somebody who struggled with the problem of psychology is like, listen, 100 years ago, we saw the gap in our understanding when psychology failed to mature. Psychology failed to mature precisely because of the Enlightenment gap. That's why psychology failed to mature. And the concept of psychology fell inside of this gap and became this fragmented shit show precisely because nobody could constrain what it is that people were talking about. Well, consciousness is doing the same thing. It's the exact same problem. There's no constraint on the structure. There's no shared understanding of the nature of ontology of epistemology that binds the stuff together, properly places the kind of angle science has on this particular phenomena in a way that cumulifies and complexifies with clarity. And I believe Utah does that, in a way that leaves me like, yeah, no shit. This is the way this stuff binds together.
Humilifies and complexifies.
Yep.
And you our attempts at understanding consciousness, but also you mentioned the meaning crisis. And so two places of the lack of a conciliant view would, or this misunderstanding of the nature of science could play into there coming to mind is one would be through incoherence, a sense of meaninglessness in terms of a lack of a sense of understanding or significance for things. And then the other, I guess, would be sometimes this God impulse, some of the forms it tends to take, it seems, would be this belief in this, that there is such a God view. And then from this, by virtue of not being able to find the things we value within it, we think of those things as less because we can't situate it. So it's like both with not being able to have a grip on anything and with this kind of this overreach and
perfect. Yeah, let me actually maybe we'll come back and have another conversation. So let me summarize just what I said about consciousness.
All right. At 12:30 I have to run. So
yeah. Okay. So then this will be a teaser for our next conversation. Okay. So real quick, my journey took me onto this path of mindedness. There's the first order mind layer, which Dave Chalmers erroneously calls the easy problem, but he doesn't really get it right. You got to get mindedness out of the world, and then it's a mindedness loop. And then you can see mind two as a particular kind of perspectival epistemic portal. So that's the way to frame the emergence of a structure that's modeling the first order structure. And actually, when you get the system, you'll be able to see that the field, which with these conscious states, are then bound by a particular relevance realizing perspective that for conscious contents. And then when you actually have that perspectival epistemic portal theory of mind two, you can then take the theories of consciousness and organize what they're pointing to with the various properties inside of a nested system. So you get a system that has been missing based on all sorts of philosophical meta-theoretical confusions. You then specify the system and you see that the system actually binds all the mysteries of the properties together. Just like carness for the tribe can then get bound to a theory of systems of cars. So the perspectival theory of mind two binds the mysteries of the properties of consciousness into a system that has been not delineated. And this system delineates it. And then once you delineate the system, you bind the properties, and all of a sudden, what was this unbelievable miracle? Like, nobody knows how this stuff happens. Like, actually, we really do. We just have been confused and talking about a lot of it. That's 90% of it, really, or 80, whatever. So there's that. The hard problem of consciousness, all of this actually points to this other problem, which is I think you're really speaking to, if we add a little Nietzsche to it, which you reference. So let's remind ourselves what happened to Western Europe. They were all bound together. 99% of the people recognized the great chain of being and God, right? At the top of the great chain of being in a second world on top of the natural world. That's everybody's worldview. That's a real worldview. That's a real coherent worldview. Okay. Unfortunately, physics comes along and properties of issues like causal closure and say supervenience basically say that render this completely unintelligible, this second layer of existence. And so then you have to have real sort of extreme faith, or you sacrifice that, and then it has the intellectual integrity for it crumbles, and you get physicalism. Okay. Or / materialism. But physicalism and materialism grounds only out at the material worldview and loosely into life, and does not give you a human worldview that includes your perspective, worldview. Okay. In fact, that's why you get a limited materialism physical. It just tries to then exit it out. All right. Which is a completely inadequate solution. I mean, it's ridiculous. Okay. So we are stuck then with a broken worldview. My whole life purpose, ultimately seeded by Utah, is to get I think there's an outline available for the coherent, what is actual real worldview? A coherent worldview of how you are viewing in the world. And I call it the teenage view. Okay. And if we go backwards, the N is the proper construal of naturalism. Okay. The proper construal of naturalism. That's N. The first E going backwards is extended, which means we're actually going to do all the work that I'm talking about here and get consciousness, okay, subjective conscious experience, and human knowing into the equation. All right. And partly we do that by being clear about what emergence is. That's the second E. Okay. And be clear about emergence in relationship to reduction. All right. And transform science from its reductive roots into a proper construal of what emergence is so that it's scientifically justified emergence. All right. And then ultimately transcend it, which basically means all of this knowledge needs to be put forth towards wisdom and the path of liberation, which, by the way, binds ultimately to the Eastern Enlightenment traditions, which allow us to transcend egoic structures, get back in touch with awareness. And this vision is about holding our egoic structures of human consciousness and our concerns in the world with a transcendent and ultimately imminent experience of being in the world. Okay, so you get transcendent, emergent, extended naturalism. And what that does is it clarifies what science is doing, enables us to be clear about what the one world is that we're in. It enables us to understand emergence in relationship to an extended view that includes the scientists, and ultimately also situates itself so we can transcend the ego and be properly situated toward wisdom. Either way, that's under God. Okay. So when we marry the coin to the tree in the garden under God, what we mean is we're going to find our subjective experience of being, we're going to align it to natural science. We're going to place it in a wise worldview that orients towards transcendence, God of transcendence as a symbol, okay, and not an ontological commitment, but it is a guiding force to what would be wise living for a collective.
But there's more than just our egocentric perspective.
Totally. I mean, anyone that's done any kind of growth and development in this always knows that. Right? I would hope. I mean, that's pretty well documented.
Has tried to teach me this lesson in many ways.
Yeah, well, it's actually really pretty simple. I mean,
I'm a stubborn bastard, though. So.
Yeah, but I mean, once you realize that you can take, if you're a Vygotskian and you hold a Vygotskian view, then all of a sudden you realize actually you can take. There's the multiplicity of perspectives, but no particular perspective, and you can essentially lose yourself between the multiplicity of perspectives, and all of a sudden you're bound in that space with a transcendent view.
It's good to be talking to you again.
It's good to be talking, friend. All right, it's 12:30. I think we both got to roll.
All right. I'm looking forward to next time.
Amen.